Imagine you're walking into your local grocery store. You grab a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, maybe a carton of eggs. You get to the register, pull out a $20 bill, the same bill you've used your entire life, and the cashier looks at you like you just handed them a Monopoly ticket. They shake their head. "Sorry," they say, "we don't take those anymore." It sounds like a dystopian nightmare, right? The kind of thing that only happens in collapsed states like Venezuela or Zimbabwe. But here's the terrifying truth. The only reason that piece of paper in your pocket has value, the only reason you can trade it for food, fuel and shelter, is because of a secret handshake made in a darkroom 50 years ago. For half a century, the United States has lived in an economic fairy tale, printing infinite money to buy real-world goods because the rest of the planet was forced to use our currency to buy energy. But the engine that kept that dream alive is sputtering. The handshake is broken, and the timeline for the end of the American empire isn't measured in decades anymore, it's measured in years. Today, we are going to peel back the layers of the greatest financial trick ever pulled. We're going to walk through the secret meetings, the assassinations, and the shadow wars that kept the dollar on the throne, and most importantly, we're going to look at exactly what happens to you when the king finally falls. Welcome to the slow, painful death of the petrodollar. 1. This secret deal that saved America. To understand how the world ends, we have to go back to how it began. And it didn't begin in a boardroom in New York or a congressional hearing in DC. It began on a humid morning in July 1974 in the coastal city of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Let's set the scene, because the vibe in America at this moment was absolutely wretched. The year is 1974. The glory days of the 1950s are dead and buried. The country is bleeding. President Richard Nixon is drowning in the Watergate scandal and about to resign in disgrace. But the real crisis isn't political, it's economic. 3 years earlier, in 1971, Nixon had shocked the world by closing the gold window. Up until that point, every US dollar was basically a claim check for a specific amount of gold sitting in Fort Knox. But America had printed too many claim checks to pay for the Vietnam War and the Great Society welfare programs. Foreign nations, led by the French, started calling our bluff, demanding their gold. Nixon didn't have it. So, he defaulted. He told the world, "Sorry, your dollars are now just paper." The dollar crashed. Inflation tore through the American suburbs, and then, just to kick us while we were down, the Arab nations launched the 1973 oil embargo. They turned off the taps to punish the West for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. If you're too young to remember this, ask your parents or grandparents. It was chaos. Gas prices quadrupled overnight. People waited in lines for 6 hours just to fill up their tanks. Americans were shooting each other at gas stations. The stock market lost 45% of its value. The US economy looked like it was heading for a total collapse. The dollar was dying. Enter William Simon. You probably haven't heard of him, but William Simon is the man who arguably saved the American empire. He was the newly appointed Treasury Secretary, but before that he was a bond trader at Salomon Brothers. And not just any trader, he was a shark. He was arrogant, chain-smoking, and brilliant. He understood one thing better than anyone else: debt. In July 1974, President Nixon sent Simon on a diplomatic tour of Europe and the Middle East. That was the cover story. The press was told it was a standard meet and greet. But the real mission was secret. Simon took a small team and flew to Saudi Arabia for a 4-day layover in Jeddah. His orders from the White House were blunt and terrifying. Do not come back empty-handed. Failure would mean the Soviet Union wins the Cold War, and the American economy implodes. Simon sat down with the Saudi royal family and made them an offer that sounds like something out of a mafia movie. The deal was simple but revolutionary. Part 1. The United States would guarantee the survival of the House of Saud. We would sell them the most advanced military weapons on Earth: fighter jets, tanks, missiles. We would be their bodyguard in a very dangerous neighborhood. If anyone, Iran, Iraq, the Soviets, Israel, looked at them the wrong way, Uncle Sam would step in. Part 2. In exchange, Saudi Arabia had to do 2 things. First, they had to use their dominant position in OPEC to ensure that every single drop of oil sold anywhere in the world was priced in US dollars. Not German marks, not Japanese yen, and certainly not gold. Only dollars. This meant that if France wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they first had to buy US dollars to pay for it. If Japan wanted energy, they had to buy US dollars. This created a permanent artificial demand for the US dollar that would never go away. But wait, there was a catch. The Saudis were about to make trillions of dollars selling this oil. What were they going to do with all that cash? They couldn't just stuff it under the mattress in the palace. This leads to part 3, the genius stroke of the deal, recycling. Simon convinced the Saudis to take those billions of petrodollars and immediately invest them back into the United States. Specifically, they would buy US Treasury bonds. They would use their oil profits to fund America's national debt. Think about the elegance of this scam. We print paper dollars to buy their oil. They take those paper dollars and lend them back to us so we can buy more oil. It was a perpetual motion machine of wealth extraction. America got oil for free, and the rest of the world paid for it by dealing with the inflation. But the Saudis had one major condition. They were paranoid. They knew that if the rest of the Arab world found out they were funding the US government, Israel's biggest ally, King Faisal might wake up with a knife in his back. The deal had to be invisible, so William Simon did something unprecedented. He rigged the US national debt auctions. Normally when the US sells debt, it's a public auction. Everyone knows who bought what. But Simon created a special add-on system strictly for the Saudi central bank. It allowed them to buy billions in US debt secretly, bypassing the auction completely. No paper trail, no public records. For 40 years, this secret clause was hidden from the American public. It wasn't until 2016, after a Freedom of Information Act request by Bloomberg, that the Treasury finally admitted the scale of the Saudi holdings. This handshake in Jeddah was the birth of the petrodollar. It stabilized the US currency, it funded our military expansion, and it allowed Americans to consume far more than we produced for 5 decades. It was the greatest economic moat ever built. But moats dry up, and alliances crumble. As we're about to see, the Saudis didn't sign a suicide pact. They signed a business deal, and business conditions are changing. Business conditions are changing. 2. How the dollar actually conquered the world. Okay, so William Simon and the Saudis shook hands, the deal was done. But to truly understand why your grocery bill is skyrocketing today, you have to understand the mechanics of the machine they built. You have to understand how the dollar went from being America's money to the oxygen of the global economy. To explain this, I don't want you to think like an American. I want you to imagine you are the finance minister of a developing nation. Let's call it the Republic of Hard Work. It's 1985. Your country is industrializing. You have factories, you have ambitious people, and you have resources. But you have one massive problem. You don't have oil. Without oil, your factories stop running, your trucks stop moving, the lights go out, and your people starve. You need to import it. So you call up Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Nigeria, and you say, I would like to buy 1 million barrels of oil, please. You offer to pay them in your local currency, the hard work peso. The line goes dead. They laugh at you. Why? Because nobody wants your pesos. They can't spend them. They can't buy missiles with them. They can't buy real estate in London with them. They tell you, come back when you have US dollars. This is the trap. This is the mechanism that conquered the world. To keep your country alive, you now have to go out and find US dollars. But you can't print them. Only the US Federal Reserve can do that. So, how do you get them? You have to work for them. You have to force your citizens to wake up at 5 a.m, go to a factory and sew t-shirts, assemble electronics, or grow bananas. You then put those real, tangible goods, which cost sweat, blood, and natural resources to create, on a boat and send them to the United States. The United States receives your t-shirts and bananas. In exchange, they send you pieces of green paper with dead presidents on them, or more accurately, digital digits on a screen. Think about the unfairness of that trade for a second. Your country gave up real wealth, labour, time, resources. The US gave up nothing. The cost to print a $100 bill is about 14 cents. The US gets the TV, you get the paper, but you take that paper because you have no choice and you send it to Saudi Arabia to get your oil. Now, follow the money. What does Saudi Arabia do with those dollars? As we discussed per the secret deal, they don't hide them under a mattress. They turn around and invest them in US Treasury bonds. They lend that money back to the United States government, earning interest. This is the petrodollar recycling loop, and it is the economic equivalent of a cheat code in a video game. In the 1960s, the French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously called this America's exorbitant privilege. He was furious about it. He realized that while France, Germany and Japan had to hustle and export real cars and wine to pay for their imports, the United States could simply write a check. If the check bounced, we'd just print more money to cover it. Because every nation needed oil, every nation needed to hoard dollars. This created an artificial bottomless demand for US currency. It meant the United States could run massive deficits that would bankrupt any other nation. We could fund a welfare state and a warfare state simultaneously. We could have guns and butter. But there was a dark side to this privilege, a cost that most Americans didn't see until it was too late. Because the whole world was desperate to get dollars to buy oil, the value of the dollar stayed artificially high. A strong dollar sounds great, right? It means cheap vacations to Europe and cheap electronics at Walmart. But for American manufacturers, it was a death sentence. A strong dollar made American goods expensive for the rest of the world. It made it impossible for a factory in Ohio to compete with a factory in China or Vietnam. The petrodollar system effectively demanded that the US economy transition from making stuff to making debt. We hollowed out the Rust Belt, we closed the steel mills, we shuttered the textile plants, we exported our industrial base and replaced it with a financialized economy of banks, hedge funds and service jobs. We traded our independence for cheap imports and the ability to borrow cheaply, and for decades the world played along. Why? Because the system was stable, the US Navy patrolled the shipping lanes, and frankly, there was no alternative. If you tried to buck the system, you got crushed. The dollar was the only game in town. It was the cleanest dirty shirt in the laundry basket. Even America's enemies had to use the dollar. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union sold oil in dollars. North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, when they sell on the global market, the benchmark pricing is in dollars. It's insidious. You cannot escape it. This system turned the US Treasury bond into the global risk-free asset. It's the piggy bank of the world. When China makes a profit, they buy treasuries. When Japan makes a profit, they buy treasuries. Central banks hold trillions of dollars in reserves just in case. But this system relies on one crucial psychological pillar: trust. Trust that the US will pay its debts. Trust that the dollar will hold its value. And most importantly, trust that the US won't weaponize the currency system against the people holding it. For 40 years, that trust held. The system was neutral. It was like a public utility. The water company doesn't shut off your water just because they don't like your politics. The dollar was the plumbing of the world, and the US was just the plumber. But then we started messing with the plumbing. We started deciding who could drink the water and who died of thirst. In the next section, we're going to look at what happens when a dictator decides he's tired of playing by these rules. We're going to look at a man who controlled 10% of the world's oil and who made the fatal mistake of asking the most dangerous question in history. Why can't I sell my oil in euros? His name was Saddam Hussein, and his decision may have been the real reason for a war that defined a generation. 3. Saddam's Euro mistake and the Iraq War. Let's play a word association game. If I say Iraq War, what pops into your head? Weapons of mass destruction? Colin Powell holding a vial of anthrax at the UN? Mission accomplished? The axis of evil? Yellow cake uranium? For the last 2 decades, that is the narrative we have been fed. We were told that Saddam Hussein was a madman with his finger on a nuclear button, ready to strike the West. We were told he was harbouring Al-Qaeda. We were told we had to fight them over there so we didn't have to fight them here. But what if I told you that the most dangerous weapon Saddam Hussein possessed wasn't a chemical missile or a biological agent? What if I told you his most lethal weapon was a bank account denominated in the wrong currency? Welcome to the theory of petrodollar warfare. To understand this, we have to rewind the tape to November 2000. The Twin Towers are still standing. The dot-com bubble is bursting. And in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein is frustrated. He's been under crushing UN sanctions for a decade. Under the UN's Oil for Food program, Iraq was allowed to sell oil. But the money went into a UN-controlled escrow account in New York to ensure he spent it on humanitarian supplies, not weapons. But Saddam wanted to send a message. He wanted to spit in the face of the American empire. So, on November 6, 2000, Iraq made a stunning announcement. The Iraqi State Oil Marketing Organization told the United Nations that from this moment forward, they would no longer accept US dollars for their oil. They demanded payment in the euro. Now, you have to understand how laughable this sounded at the time. The euro was the new kid on the block. It had only been introduced as an accounting currency in 1999, and physically it wouldn't even be in people's pockets until 2002. It was weak. It was trading at around 82 cents to the dollar. Financial analysts in London and New York openly mocked Saddam. They said, "He's an idiot. He's letting his political hatred lose him millions in revenue." And initially, they were right. By forcing the UN to convert his oil sales into a depreciating currency, Iraq lost a fortune. The skepticism was so high that the UN actually allowed it, probably thinking, "Go ahead, bankrupt yourself." But then, something strange happened. The wind shifted. Between 2001 and 2002, the euro began to rally. It climbed from 82 cents back up to parity with the dollar, and then kept climbing. Suddenly, the madman of the Middle East looked like a financial genius. By pricing his oil in euros, Iraq was actually making more profit than if he had stayed with the dollar. This caught the attention of some very powerful, very nervous people. Not just in Washington, but in Caracas, Tehran, and Moscow. Here is the nightmare scenario that began keeping Federal Reserve officials awake at night. Contagion. Iraq controlled the second largest proven oil reserves in the world at that time. If Saddam Hussein proved that you could sell oil in euros and actually make a better return, what was stopping the rest of OPEC from following suit? Imagine if Iran, which had been under US sanctions for years, decided to switch. Imagine if Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, who was already a thorn in America's side, decided to switch. In April 2002, a man named Javad Yarjani, the head of market analysis for OPEC, gave a speech in Oviedo, Spain. It was a boring, technical speech, the kind that usually puts people to sleep. But midway through, he dropped a bombshell. He suggested that, maybe in the long term, it might make sense for OPEC to shift some of its reserves into euros. He hinted that the dollar's monopoly wasn't set in stone. This was the smoke alarm going off. If OPEC shifted to the euro, the demand for US dollars would collapse. Nations around the world would dump their US Treasury bonds to buy euro bonds. The recycling loop we talked about in the last section, the engine of American prosperity, would seize up. The US dollar would crash. Inflation would skyrocket, and the ability of the US government to fund its massive budget deficits would vanish. The petrodollar wasn't just a currency arrangement, it was the structural beam holding up the American superpower, and Saddam was taking a sledgehammer to it. Now, look at the timeline. It is almost too perfect. November 2000. Iraq switches to the euro. 2001-2002. The euro rises, Iraq profits. OPEC starts whispering about a shift. August 2002. The Bush administration suddenly ramps up the rhetoric about regime change in Iraq. The focus shifts from hunting bin Laden in the caves of Afghanistan to hunting Saddam in the palaces of Baghdad. We were told it was about WMDs. We were shown satellite photos of aluminum tubes. We were told about yellowcake uranium from Niger. But let's look at the smoking gun that nobody talks about. On March 19, 2003, the US military launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. Shock and awe lit up the Baghdad sky. Within weeks, the statue of Saddam was toppled. The regime was decapitated. And what was the very first economic decision made by the American occupiers? Before the dust had even settled, before a new government was formed, the Coalition Provisional Authority, the US-run government in Iraq, issued a directive. The sale of Iraqi oil was immediately switched back to US dollars. The euro account was closed. The billions of euros that Iraq had accumulated were converted back into greenbacks. The threat was neutralized. The message to the rest of OPEC was loud, clear and bloody. If you try to leave the dollar, we will come for you. Critics will say this is a conspiracy theory. They'll say, oh, come on, you don't invade a country over currency exchange rates. And fair enough, history is complex. There were neoconservatives who wanted to spread democracy. There were defense contractors who wanted contracts. There were geopolitical strategists worried about Israel. It's rarely just one thing, but in the world of geopolitics, you have to follow the money. Consider the oil law that was pushed by the US administration in 2007. The draft law, which was heavily influenced by Western oil executives, didn't just cement the dollar usage, it proposed production sharing agreements, PSAs, that would have given foreign oil companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, massive control over Iraq's reserves for up to 30 years. Before the war, Iraq's oil was fully nationalized. The profits belonged to the state. the US tried to privatize it. While the full privatization didn't pass due to massive Iraqi resistance, the Western oil majors eventually got back in via service contracts. But the most important victory for Washington was secured on day one. Iraq was back in the petrodollar orbit. This war bought the dollar another decade of dominance. It scared the living daylights out of anyone else thinking about switching. Iran, who had been flirting with the idea of an oil bourse priced in euros, suddenly got very quiet about it. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela kept shouting, but he was careful not to push too hard. The world saw Saddam hanging from a rope, and they understood the price of financial rebellion. But you can't bomb an idea out of existence. You can execute a dictator, but you can't execute simple math. The math remained: the US was printing too much money, the debt was growing, and the rest of the world was getting tired of subsidizing the American lifestyle. While the US was busy bogged down in the insurgency in Fallujah and Ramadi, spending trillions on a war to protect the dollar, another threat was rising in Africa. A threat that wasn't about selling oil in euros, but about something far more dangerous: gold. In the next section, we travel to Libya. We're going to meet Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. He wasn't just an eccentric dictator with funny sunglasses and female bodyguards. He was the architect of a plan that would have united the entire African continent and severed the financial chains of the West once and for all. He called it the gold dinar. And just like Saddam, his curiosity about alternative currencies would cost him everything. Gaddafi's gold dinar and the African dream. If Saddam Hussein was the man who tried to change the currency of oil, Muammar Gaddafi was the man who tried to change the currency of an entire continent. And if you think the war in Iraq was about oil, wait until you hear why NATO really turned the skies over Libya into a shooting gallery in 2011. Let's transport you to 2009. You're standing in a grand conference hall in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The room is filled with African heads of state. At the podium stands Gaddafi. He is the king of kings, the chairman of the African Union. He is charismatic, eccentric, and absolutely flush with cash. Libya is not a poor country. In fact, under Gaddafi, it has the highest standard of living in Africa. Free electricity, free healthcare. Newlyweds receive $50,000 from the government to buy their first apartment. Gas is 14 cents a litre. But Gaddafi isn't satisfied with just making Libya rich. He has a bigger dream. A dream that has terrified European colonizers for a century. The United States of Africa. Gaddafi is tired of seeing Africa rich in resources but poor in money. He looks at the map and sees a continent that produces gold, diamonds, oil, cobalt and uranium, yet sets the prices for none of them. He sees African nations trading with each other, using the currencies of their former masters, the British pound, the US dollar and especially the French CFA franc. So he proposes a radical solution. He calls it the gold dinar. The plan was ambitious but simple. Libya would lead the creation of a new Pan-African currency. But unlike the dollar or the euro, which are fiat currencies backed by nothing but government promises, the gold dinar would be backed by actual physical gold. Gaddafi had the muscle to pull this off. Libya's central bank was sitting on a massive hoard, estimated at 143 tons of gold and a similar amount in silver. At the time, this stash was worth over $7 billion. His vision? He told African nations, let's stop selling our oil and minerals for paper money that the West prints out of thin air. Let's demand they pay us in gold dinars. If they want our resources, they have to buy our currency. This would have shifted the economic centre of gravity from Paris and New York to Tripoli. It would have empowered a continent that had been exploited for 400 years. But there was one country that looked at this plan and saw an existential threat. And it wasn't the United States, it was France. To understand why, you have to know about the CFA franc. This is one of the biggest scams in modern finance. 14 African countries, mostly former French colonies, use the CFA franc. It is a currency that is printed in France and controlled by the French central bank. For decades, France required these African nations to deposit 50% of their foreign currency reserves into the French treasury. Essentially, France was holding their wallets. This system allows France to maintain massive influence over its former colonies, effectively getting free loans and cheap resources. It is the lifeblood of French soft power in Africa. Gaddafi's gold dinar was designed to kill the CFA franc. If African nations switched to a gold-backed currency, The CFA system would collapse. France's influence in West Africa would evaporate overnight. Now, fast forward to February 2011. The Arab Spring is sweeping across the Middle East. Protests erupt in Benghazi against Gaddafi's 40-year rule. The Western media narrative is immediate and uniform. Gaddafi is a brutal dictator killing his own people. We must intervene to save the civilians. And look, let's be real. Gaddafi was a dictator. He was ruthless. He tortured dissidents. He wasn't a choir boy. But the world is full of ruthless dictators that the West happily does business with. Why was this specific dictator, at this specific moment, priority number one? We don't have to guess. We have the receipts. On April 1st, 2011, a man named Sidney Blumenthal, a longtime advisor and confidant to then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, sent an email to her private server. This email was later declassified and released to the public. You can go read it right now on the State Department's virtual reading room. The subject line was, "France's client and Gaddafi's gold." In this intelligence memo, Blumenthal explains exactly why French President Nicolas Sarkozy was leading the charge for a military attack on Libya. He lists 5 reasons. The first 4 are standard politics: obtaining Libyan oil, increasing French influence, etc. But the 5th reason is the smoking gun. Blumenthal wrote that the French intelligence service had discovered Gaddafi's plan to use his massive gold and silver reserves to create a pan-African currency. The memo explicitly states, this gold was accumulated prior to the current rebellion and was intended to be used to establish a pan-African currency based on the Libyan golden dinar. This plan was designed to provide the francophone African countries with an alternative to the French franc, CFA. The email continues, stating that French intelligence officers discovered this plan shortly after the rebellion began, and it was one of the factors that influenced President Sarkozy's decision to commit the French military to the attack. There it is, in black and white. The West didn't invade Libya just to protect civilians in Benghazi. They invaded because Gaddafi had 143 tons of gold and a plan to break the French banking system, and the response was swift. In March 2011, a NATO coalition led by France, the UK and the US began bombing Libya. They destroyed the Libyan Air Force, they destroyed the command centres, they armed the rebels. By October 2011, Gaddafi was dead. He was found hiding in a drainage pipe in Sirte, dragged out by rebels, beaten and executed on camera. And what happened to the gold? That is the billion-dollar question. The 143 tons of gold vanished. Some say it was stolen by the rebels, some say it was trucked across the desert into Niger, some say it's sitting in vaults in London or Paris now. But one thing is certain. The gold dinar died with Gaddafi. The dream of a unified African currency was buried in the rubble of Tripoli. Today Libya is a failed state. It is a fractured ruin ruled by competing warlords. There are open-air slave markets where human beings are sold for a few $100s. The oil still flows, of course, but the profits don't go to building apartments for newlyweds anymore. The message to the global south was reinforced, written in blood just like in Iraq: do not challenge the financial hegemony. But here is the irony. While the West was busy playing whack-a-mole with dictators in the Middle East and Africa, they took their eye off the real threat. They were so focused on crushing the small rebellions that they didn't notice the giant waking up in the East. They didn't notice that Russia and China were watching these wars and taking notes. Vladimir Putin saw what happened to Saddam. He saw what happened to Gaddafi. He realized that as long as Russia was part of the Western financial system, they were vulnerable. If the US could turn off Iraq's money, they could turn off Russia's money. So, while NATO was celebrating the fall of Tripoli, Moscow began to quietly build a fortress. They started dumping their US dollars. They started buying gold, lots of it. And they started coding a new digital language that would allow banks to talk to each other without America listening. In the next section, we're going to look at the moment the US finally pulled the trigger on the financial nuke, kicking a major superpower out of the banking system, and how that decision backfired spectacularly, accelerating the very thing it was meant to prevent. 5. Weaponized finance and the Russian pivot. If the Iraq War was a warning shot and Libya was an execution, what happened in February 2022 was a suicide bombing. Not a physical one, but a financial one. It was the moment the West decided to detonate the foundation of its own economic power in a desperate attempt to stop a tank division. Let's take you back to February 24th, 2022. Vladimir Putin announces the special military operation. Russian tanks roll across the border into Ukraine. The world watches in horror. The response from the West was immediate. But while sending javelins and stingers took time, the financial response was instantaneous. The US, the UK and the European Union decided to unleash the financial nuclear option. They were going to do something that had never been done to a G20 economy before. They didn't just sanction a few oligarchs or ban some vodka imports. They went for the jugular. First, they kicked major Russian banks out of SWIFT. Now, you hear this acronym a lot, but let's clarify what SWIFT actually is. It stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. Think of it as the WhatsApp group chat for global banks. It's a messaging system that allows a bank in New York to tell a bank in Moscow, "Hey, I'm sending you $10 million. If you get kicked out of SWIFT, you're financially blind and mute. You can't send money. You can't receive money. You're exiled from the global village. For decades, this was the ultimate threat. It was the weapon the US held to the head of every nation, saying, "Behave or we will unplug you." But then the West did something even more extreme, something that made central bankers in Beijing, Riyadh, and Brasilia choke on their coffee. They froze the reserves of the Central Bank of Russia. Russia had spent years building up a fortress balance sheet. They had $630 billion in foreign reserves, money they had earned by selling oil and gas. They thought this money was safe. They thought that sovereign property rights were sacred. Over a single weekend, the US and its allies froze roughly $300 billion of that money. Just like that. Poof. Gone. The narrative in the West was triumphant. We have crushed the ruble, we have destroyed their war chest, the Russian economy will collapse in weeks. And initially, the ruble did crash. It fell to 140 to the dollar. President Biden stood up and bragged that the ruble was now rubble. But then, the smoke cleared, and the West realized they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. By weaponizing the dollar so aggressively, they broke the cardinal rule of banking: neutrality. Think about it. If you deposit money in a bank, you expect to be able to withdraw it, even if the bank manager hates you. If the bank manager can seize your life savings just because he disagrees with your politics, you will find a new bank. The message sent to the world was chilling. Your dollars are not your money. They are permission slips from the US government, and those permissions can be revoked at any time. This was the wake-up call for the global South. China looked at this and thought, "We have $3 trillion in reserves. If we invade Taiwan, they will take it all." Saudi Arabia thought, "If we disagree with American foreign policy, our money is gone." So instead of collapsing, Russia pivoted. And this pivot is what killed the fear of US sanctions forever. Putin did the unthinkable. On March 23, 2022, he announced that unfriendly countries, meaning Europe, would have to pay for Russian gas in rubles. This was a direct violation of the petrodollar order. Europe was outraged. They said, "That's a breach of contract." Putin effectively said, "You stole our dollars, so dollars are worthless to us. Use rubles or freeze." And guess what? Europe folded. They needed the gas. They set up complex accounts at Gazprom Bank to convert euros to rubles. The ruble didn't just recover, it became the best performing currency in the world against the dollar later that year. But the bigger story is what happened behind the scenes. Russia began building a parallel financial system, a shadow economy that the US couldn't touch. Since they were kicked out of SWIFT, they ramped up their own system, called SPFS. It's clunky, it's smaller, but it works. More importantly, they connected it to China's system, CIPS, Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. Suddenly, Russian oil started flowing to India and China in record volumes. But it wasn't being sold in dollars, it was being sold in rupees, yuan and dirhams. A shadow fleet of oil tankers emerged, hundreds of aging ships with obscure ownership, sailing without Western insurance, carrying Russian oil to the world. The US tried to impose a price cap on Russian oil, saying, "You can't sell it for more than $60 a barrel." The market laughed. Russia sold it for whatever the market would pay, and the global South happily bought it. Why? Because India doesn't care about the war in Donbas. India cares about cheap energy for its 1.4 billion people. This was the turning point. The sanctions failed to stop the war, but they succeeded in destroying the myth of the dollar's indispensability. Before 2022, the idea of trading oil without dollars was a fringe theory. After 2022, it became a survival strategy. The volume of trade between Russia and China exploded, hitting over $240 billion in 2023, with almost none of it settled in dollars. The US had played its ace card. They fired the financial nuke, and Russia survived. This revealed a terrifying truth to Washington. The world needs commodities more than it needs dollars. You can print dollars, but you can't print oil. You can't print wheat. You can't print nickel or palladium. Russia has the stuff. America has the paper. In a war of attrition, the stuff wins. Now the floodgates are open, the fear is gone. Other nations are looking at Russia and saying, yeah, hey, the water is fine outside the dollar system, and leading this charge is the dragon in the room. The country with the industrial might to actually rival the US. In the next section, we're going to look at the Petroyuan. China isn't just buying oil in its own currency. It's building a mechanism to turn that currency directly into gold, creating a loophole that allows oil producers to exit the dollar forever without taking any risk. This is the mechanism that keeps the Saudi king up at night, in a good way. 6. The rise of the Petroyuan. There is an old rule in business: the customer is always right. But there is a more important rule in geopolitics: the biggest customer makes the rules. For decades, the United States was the world's biggest importer of oil. We were the thirsty giant. That meant we got to decide how the oil was sold. But thanks to the shale revolution, America is now energy independent. We don't need Saudi oil the way we used to. But you know who does? China. China is now the largest importer of crude oil on the planet. Every single day, a fleet of supertankers arrives in Chinese ports to feed its massive industrial machine. And for years, China had to do something that made its leaders absolutely sick to their stomachs. They had to pay for that oil in US dollars. Think about the absurdity of this from Beijing's perspective. China is America's biggest rival. Yet, to keep their lights on, they have to use their rival's currency. This means China has to constantly earn dollars, hold dollars, and use the dollar banking system. Every time China buys a barrel of oil from Angola or Russia, the transaction clears through a US bank, giving Washington a map of China's energy flows and the power to freeze them. Xi Jinping decided this was a strategic chokehold he could no longer tolerate. He wanted to buy oil in yuan, but there was a problem. A big one. Oil producers, like the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Iranians, didn't want yuan. Why? Because the yuan is a trapped currency. It's strictly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. You can't just freely take it out of China. If you sell $1 billion worth of oil to China and get paid in yuan, what can you do with it? You can buy cheap plastic toys or build a factory in Shenzhen, but you can't easily go buy real estate in London or stocks in New York. The oil sheikhs looked at the yuan and said, no thanks. We prefer the dollar. We trust the dollar. So in March 2018, China launched a financial product that changed the game. They opened the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, INE. They started offering the world's first yuan-denominated crude oil futures contract. And to solve the trust issue, they added a feature that is arguably the most brilliant financial trap ever set. They linked the oil contract to gold. Here is how the golden loophole works. You're an oil producer. You sell oil to China. China pays you in yuan. You're worried the yuan might devalue or get stuck in China. So, you immediately take that yuan and use it to buy physical gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. You then load that gold onto a plane and fly it back to your vault in the Middle East. Do you see what just happened? China effectively recreated a gold standard for trade. They created a mechanism where oil is traded for gold, with the yuan just acting as a temporary middleman for a few seconds. The producers love this. Gold is the ultimate safe asset. It has no counterparty risk. It can't be frozen by the US Treasury. It can't be printed into oblivion by the Federal Reserve. This system bypasses the US dollar, the US banking system, and SWIFT entirely. It is a completely dark, independent loop. Western analysts laughed at this in 2018. They said the volume would be tiny. They said, the Brent and WTI benchmarks are too strong, nobody will switch. They were wrong. The volume on the Shanghai Exchange has exploded. It is now the third largest oil market in the world, and in a crisis, like say a war over Taiwan, this market ensures that China can keep buying energy even if the US completely exiles them from the dollar system. But the Petroyuan isn't just about survival for China. It's about seduction. China is actively courting the Saudis, telling them, the Americans are lecturing you about human rights. They are blocking your weapon sales. They are devaluing the money you hold. We, on the other hand, just want to do business. We will pay you in gold. And the Saudis are listening. In the next section, we're going to look at the moment the marriage finally broke. We'll examine the recent stunning shift in Saudi foreign policy that signals the official end of the 1974 deal and the beginning of a new era in the desert. 7. Saudi Arabia betrays the 1974 Pact. Relationships end. Sometimes it's a slow drift, sometimes it's a screaming match, and sometimes one partner realizes they've been taken for granted for 50 years and decides to start dating the guy you hate. We are witnessing the divorce of the century between Washington and Riyadh, and unlike a celebrity breakup, this one is going to cost you money. To understand why the 1974 petrodollar deal is dying, you have to look at the man currently running the show in Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS. MBS is not his grandfather. He isn't interested in bowing to American presidents or being the quiet gas station attendant for the West. He is young, ambitious, and ruthless. He has a vision called Vision 2030 to transform his country into a global superpower, not just an oil well, and frankly, he hates how he's been treated. When Joe Biden ran for president in 2020, he didn't just criticize Saudi Arabia, he promised to make them a pariah. He stopped selling them offensive weapons to fight the Houthis in Yemen. He released intelligence reports pinning the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi directly on MBS. He effectively ghosted the Crown Prince. The Saudis took note. They realized the American security guarantee, the Part 1 of the 1974 deal, was worthless. When Iranian drones attacked Saudi oil facilities in 2019, America didn't strike back. When the Houthis fired missiles at Jeddah, America shrugged. So MBS decided to go shopping for a new best friend. Enter Xi Jinping. In December 2022, the Chinese president visited Riyadh. The welcome was fit for an emperor. While Biden got a fist bump in a quiet hallway, Xi got a royal procession, fighter jet flyovers, and a 3-day summit with Arab leaders. During that summit, Xi Jinping said the quiet part out loud. In a televised speech, he called for China and the Gulf nations to start settling oil and gas trades in yuan. A few weeks later, in January 2023, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the Saudi finance minister, Mohammed al-Jadaan, dropped the bomb. He told reporters, "There are no issues with discussing how we settle our trade arrangements, whether it is in the US dollar, whether it is the euro, whether it is the Saudi riyal." Read that again. For 49 years, the answer was dollars only. Now the answer is we're open to suggestions. This is the sound of the monopoly breaking. There was a lot of noise on the internet in June 2024 about the official expiry of the 1974 petrodollar agreement. Viral posts claimed a secret 50-year contract had lapsed on June 9th. Now, fact-checkers will tell you there was no single paper contract with a fixed expiration date. And technically, they are right. But they are missing the forest for the trees. Whether a paper contract expired is irrelevant. The alliance has expired. The exclusive marriage is over. Saudi Arabia has officially adopted a policy of Saudi first. They are joining the BRICS alliance, which we will get to in a minute. They are engaging with the Petroyuan. They are selling oil to France in euros. Why does this matter to you? Because Saudi Arabia is the central banker of oil. They are the swing producer. If they start accepting other currencies, the rest of OPEC will follow. The UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, they watch Riyadh. If the world doesn't need dollars to buy Saudi oil anymore, they don't need to hold trillions in US Treasury bonds. And if they stop buying our debt, who buys it? The Federal Reserve. Which means more money printing. Which means the inflation you're feeling at the grocery store isn't a temporary glitch, it's the new baseline. The Saudis have realized that in a multipolar world you don't pick a side, you play both sides. You sell oil to China in yuan, buy weapons from America in dollars, and stash gold in Switzerland. The petrodollar isn't dead yet, it's still the dominant currency. But it has been demoted. It is no longer the only option. It is now just one option among many. And in the world of finance, once you lose your monopoly, you lose your power. But the Saudis are just one piece of the puzzle. They are the supplier. The real revolution is happening among the consumers, the billions of people in the global south, who are tired of being pushed around by the G7. In the next section, we're going to look at the club that everyone wants to join. It started as an acronym for investment bankers, but it has morphed into an economic NATO that controls the majority of the world's population and resources. It's called BRICS, and they are building a wrecking ball aimed straight at the US Treasury. 8. BRICS and the Global South Rebellion. For the last 70 years, the global economy has been like a high school cafeteria. The cool kids sat at the G7 table. America, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Italy and Canada. They decided who got to sit with them. They decided what was on the menu, and they decided who got bullied. But something funny happened while the cool kids were busy patting themselves on the back. The nerds, the outcasts, and the quiet kids started their own table, and then they started buying up the cafeteria. Welcome to the BRICS revolution. Originally, this was just a catchy acronym invented by a Goldman Sachs economist in 2001 to group the emerging markets: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. For years, the West dismissed them as a talk shop, a random collection of countries that had nothing in common. What does a communist state like China have in common with a democracy like Brazil, they laughed. They aren't laughing anymore. In August 2023, at a summit in Johannesburg and later solidified in 2024, BRICS officially expanded. They didn't just add random countries, they added strategic heavyweights. They invited Iran, the UAE, Egypt and Ethiopia. Look at that list closely. What do you see? You see the world's gas station. By adding Iran and the UAE to a group that already includes Russia, BRICS now controls a massive chunk of the global energy supply. You see the Suez Canal, Egypt. You see the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia. This isn't a social club. This is an economic NATO. And here is the statistic that should terrify Western policymakers. In terms of purchasing power parity, PPP, which is a fancy way of measuring what money can actually buy in the real world, the BRICS nations have now officially surpassed the G7. That's right. The developing world now generates more real economic output than the developed world. The G7 creates value through financial derivatives, insurance products, and consulting fees. The BRICS nations create value through stuff. They grow the food, they mine the copper, they drill the oil, they manufacture the steel. If the G7 stops working, the world loses some hedge funds and marketing agencies. If BRICS stops working, the world freezes and starves. And what is the one thing binding this motley crew together? It's not religion. It's not politics. It is a shared hatred of the US dollar's weaponization. President Lula of Brazil stood up at the summit and asked the room a simple question. Why? Why must every country tie its trade to the dollar? Who decided that the dollar would be the currency after the gold standard disappeared? The applause was deafening. This alliance is building the infrastructure for a post-American world. They have created the New Development Bank, NDB, a direct competitor to the IMF and World Bank. The IMF imposes austerity and demands political reforms in exchange for loans. The NDB says, here's the money for your dam, or railway, we don't care about your politics. For a dictator in Africa or a struggling democracy in Asia, which loan are you going to take? The Global South, which represents about 85% of the human population, is tired of being lectured by the West. They are tired of rules-based order where the rules only apply to them. They see the US seizing Russian assets and think, we're next. So they are building a walled garden, a system where they can trade with each other without touching a single US bank. And this leads us to the technology that is going to make this separation possible. Because you can have all the political will in the world, but you need a mechanism to move the money. You need a new plumbing system. In the next section, we're going to look at the financial guillotine. It's a new type of currency that is programmable, instant, and completely bypasses the traditional banking system. It's called a CBDC, and it is the final nail in the coffin for the dollar's global dominance. 9. The CBDC revolution and dollar destruction. There is a 4-letter acronym that sounds boring, technocratic, and harmless, but it actually represents the single biggest technological threat to American power since the Soviet nuclear program. That acronym is CBDC, Central Bank Digital Currency. Now, before your eyes glaze over, let me clarify something important. This is not Bitcoin. This is not some libertine fantasy about freedom from the state. In fact, it is the exact opposite. It is the ultimate tool of state control. But more importantly for our story, it is the weapon that will render US sanctions obsolete. To understand why CBDCs are the dollar killer, we first have to look at how money moves today. It is archaic. If you're a business in China and you want to pay a supplier in Brazil, you can't just send the money. You have to use the correspondent banking system. Here is the journey your money takes. Your Chinese bank sends a message to its partner bank in New York, likely JP Morgan or Citibank. That New York bank moves US dollars from the Chinese bank's account to the Brazilian bank's account. The New York bank takes a fee. The SWIFT messaging system records the transaction. The money finally arrives in Brazil 2 to 4 days later. Notice the choke point. New York. Almost every major international cross-border payment touches a US bank at some point. This gives the United States two things. The toll booth. We make money on everyone else's trade. The panopticon. We see everything. The US Treasury knows exactly who is buying what. If they see a transaction they don't like, say a payment for Iranian drone parts, they can tell that New York bank to freeze the funds. This is how sanctions work. It's plumbing, and we own the pipes. But what if you could build a new set of pipes that didn't go through New York? Enter Project mBridge. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It is a real, live pilot program being run by the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, the central bank of central banks. It involves China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE. Project mBridge uses blockchain technology, the same tech behind crypto, but it adapts it for governments. It creates a shared ledger between these nations. Here is the new reality under mBridge. The Chinese business wants to pay the Brazilian supplier. They open their digital yuan wallet. They send the payment. The mBridge platform instantly converts the yuan into e-reals, or simply swaps the tokenized value. The money arrives in the Brazilian wallet in seconds. Cost almost zero. Time almost zero. US involvement zero. The transaction happens peer-to-peer between the central banks. There is no correspondent bank in New York. There is no SWIFT message. The US government doesn't even know the trade happened until the ship arrives at the port. This is the financial stealth bomber. China is leading the world in this technology. They have already rolled out the ECNY digital yuan to millions of citizens. They are testing it for cross-border trades right now. Think about the implications for the petrodollar. If Saudi Arabia and China fully integrate their CBDC systems, they can trade billions of dollars worth of oil instantly. The Saudis get paid in digital yuan, which they can immediately use to pay a Chinese construction firm to build a skyscraper in Riyadh. The loop is closed. The dollar isn't just not needed, it is technologically inferior. Why would you use a fax machine, SWIFT, when you have email, CBDC? Why would you pay fees to an American bank and risk getting your assets frozen when you can settle instantly for free? The US is lagging woefully behind in this race. While China has a fully functional digital currency, the US Federal Reserve is still writing white papers and debating whether a digital dollar is a good idea. We are debating privacy concerns, which are valid, while the rest of the world is building the highway of the future. And it's not just China. Russia is developing the digital ruble. India has the digital rupee. Brazil has the drex. Even the European Union is working on a digital euro. They are building a multi-rail payment world. This destroys the network effect of the dollar. For decades, you had to use dollars because everyone else used dollars. It was the only network that reached everywhere. But CBDCs are interoperable. They can talk to each other without a common language, the dollar. This technology also allows for something called atomic settlement. In the old world, there was always counterparty risk. The fear that you send the goods, but the check bounces. With programmable CBDCs, you can use smart contracts. You code the money so that the payment is released automatically the exact second the oil tanker digitally signs into the port. No trust required, no lawyers required, no US dollars required. The scary part for Washington is the loss of vision. If the global drug trade, the global weapons trade, and the global energy trade move to these encrypted direct rails, the US intelligence community goes blind. We lose our ability to track terror financing. We lose our ability to enforce embargoes. We become a bystander in the global economy, a large island nation shouting at passing ships that no longer stop at our ports. But while the rest of the world is building high-tech bypass roads around the dollar, the United States is busy doing something else that is equally destructive to its currency. We aren't just losing our technological edge, we are actively destroying the value of the dollar from the inside out. We are spending money like a drunken sailor who just stole a credit card. In the next section, we have to look at the domestic monster, the math that doesn't add up. We need to talk about the number $35,000. Because the biggest threat to the dollar isn't in Beijing or Moscow, it's in Washington, D.C. 10. The $35 trillion debt trap. We have spent the last 20 minutes talking about external threats. We've talked about Russian sanctions, Chinese gold, and Saudi princes. But the truth is, if the American empire falls, it won't be because of a foreign army marching on Washington. It will be because of simple, cold, unforgiving math. The most dangerous enemy the United States faces today is not in Beijing or Moscow. It is in the mirror. Let's talk about the number that should terrify every single person holding a US dollar. $35,000. That is $35 trillion. It is a number so large the human brain literally cannot comprehend it. If you counted to 1 million, it would take you about 11 days. If you counted to 1 trillion, it would take you 31,000 years. We owe 35 of those. For decades, politicians and economists told you this number didn't matter. They subscribed to a theory effectively called modern monetary theory, MMT, or as I like to call it, magic money tree. The idea was simple. Since the US government can print its own currency, it can never go bankrupt. It can just print money to pay its bills. Deficits are a myth. Debt is just a number on a screen, and for a long time they appeared to be right. From 2008 to 2021, interest rates were at zero. Inflation was low. The Federal Reserve could print trillions to bail out banks, fund wars, and send out stimulus checks, and the sky didn't fall. But that era of free money relied on one specific condition. The world had to want our debt. Remember the petrodollar recycling loop? The Saudis, the Chinese, the Japanese, they all took their excess dollars and bought US Treasury bonds. They subsidized our spending. They kept our borrowing costs artificially low. But now, look at the trap we have walked into. In 2022, inflation returned with a vengeance. To fight it, the Federal Reserve had to raise interest rates. They took rates from 0% to over 5% in record time. Here is where the math gets lethal. When you have $35 trillion in debt, and you raise interest rates by 5%, your interest payments explode. In 2024, the United States government hit a terrifying milestone. For the first time in history, we spent more on interest payments on the national debt than we spent on the entire national defense budget. Read that again. We are spending more just to service the credit card bill of the past than we are on the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines and Space Force combined. We are spending more on interest than on Medicare. Soon, interest will be the single largest line item in the federal budget, surpassing Social Security. This is what economists call a debt spiral, or fiscal dominance. It works like this. 1. The government runs a deficit, spends more than it makes. 2. It issues debt to cover the gap. 3. It has to pay interest on that debt. 4. The interest expense is so high that it creates an even bigger deficit. 5. So the government has to borrow more money just to pay the interest on the old money. It is a Ponzi scheme. The only way it keeps going is if you can find new suckers to buy the debt. But remember the earlier sections of this video? The suckers are walking away, China is selling treasuries, Saudi Arabia is buying gold, Russia is gone, Japan is struggling to defend its own currency and can't buy as much as it used to. So, who is buying the debt? The data is clear. The biggest buyers are now domestic. Hedge funds, money market funds, and the Federal Reserve itself. We are cannibalizing our own economy. We are printing money to buy our own debt. This brings us to the concept of exporting inflation. For 50 years, this was America's superpower. When we printed $1 trillion, those dollars didn't stay in Ohio or Florida. They flowed overseas. They went to China to buy TVs, to Saudi Arabia to buy oil, to Brazil to buy coffee. The world acted as a sponge for our inflation. We got the cheap goods, they got the inflation. But as de-dollarization accelerates, as the petrodollar dies, that sponge is drying up. If the Saudis sell oil in yuan, they don't need dollars. If China trades with Russia in rubles, they don't need dollars. So, what happens when the Federal Reserve prints $1 trillion to fund the next war or the next bailout? But the world says, no thanks, we're full. Those dollars have nowhere to go. They're trapped inside the borders of the United States. They chase domestic goods. They chase domestic real estate. They chase domestic stocks. This is why your rent is up 30%. This is why a dozen eggs cost $6. This is why a used Honda Civic costs as much as a new one used to. The inflation is coming home to roost. The US government is now caught in a trap with no exit. Option A. Default. Tell the world, sorry, we aren't paying you back. This would cause a global financial collapse that makes the Great Depression look like a picnic. It's political suicide. Option B. Austerity. Cut spending. Slash social security. Cut the military in half. Fire government workers. Raise taxes by 50%. Also political suicide. No politician will ever run on this platform. Option C. Inflate it away. This is the path of least resistance. The Federal Reserve will print the money to pay the debt. They will monetize the deficit. They will sacrifice the value of the dollar to save the bond market. History tells us that governments always choose option C. From Rome to Weimar Germany to Zimbabwe, when the debt gets unpayable, they print. They will steal your wealth not by taking it from your bank account, but by making every dollar in your bank account worth less. It is a hidden tax, and this leads to the most terrifying scenario of all, the Triffin dilemma in reverse. For years, we flooded the world with dollars. There are trillions of paper dollars, euro dollars, floating around outside the US, in foreign bank accounts, in mattresses in Argentina, in vaults in Lebanon. What happens if the world loses faith? What happens if the foreigners decide not just to stop buying our debt, but to sell the dollars they already have? Imagine a tsunami. But instead of water, it's green paper. In the next section, we're going to simulate exactly what happens when those trillions of overseas dollars turn around and come flooding back to the American homeland. It's a scenario that ends the American standard of living overnight. 11. When the dollars come flooding home. We need to talk about the scariest ghost story in economics. It's not a crash. It's not a recession. It is a phenomenon that happens when an empire finally loses its grip on the world reserve currency status. It's called the reflux. To understand this, you have to realize that for the last 50 years, the United States' biggest export hasn't been cars, or movies, or airplanes. Our biggest export has been inflation. Think of the US dollar like a product. We manufacture it, print it for free. We then sell it to the rest of the world in exchange for their coffee, their oil, their Toyotas, and their electronics. This has been a fantastic deal for us. We get the stuff, they get the paper. As a result, there are trillions of US dollars floating around outside the United States. I'm not just talking about the cash in a drug lord's basement in Mexico, or the bills in a tourist's wallet in Paris. I'm talking about the massive digital reserves held by foreign central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and international corporations. These are what economists call euro dollars. It is a massive pool of money that lives offshore. It never touches the US economy. It stays out there, facilitating global trade, greasing the gears of the world machine. As long as those dollars stay out there, they don't cause inflation in here. They are like water behind a dam. The dam is built out of confidence, the belief that the dollar is the safest place to store wealth. But what happens if the dam breaks? What happens if the Saudis, the Chinese, the Brazilians, and the Indians all decide at the same time that they don't want to hold these dollars anymore? What if they decide they would rather hold gold, or yuan, or copper mines, or farmland? They start selling their dollars. But here is the problem. Who do they sell them to? If nobody in the rest of the world wants them, those dollars have only one place left to go. They have to come home. They return to the United States to buy American assets. Now, imagine this scenario. It's a Tuesday in 2027. The news breaks that Saudi Arabia has officially dumped the dollar for all oil sales. Panic sweeps the global markets. Foreign nations rush to liquidate their US Treasury bonds. Trillions of dollars flood back into the US domestic economy. These foreign entities don't want to just hold the cash. They want to trade it for something tangible before the value drops to zero. They start buying everything. They buy American farmland. They buy American real estate. They buy shares of Apple and Microsoft. They buy machinery. They buy grain. Suddenly you have trillions of new dollars chasing the same amount of goods that existed yesterday. This is the textbook definition of hyperinflation. But it's not the good kind of inflation where your stocks go up and you feel rich. It's the destructive kind. Imagine going to the grocery store. A loaf of bread was $4 yesterday. Today, because a Chinese hedge fund just bought the entire wheat futures market to dump their dollars, bread is $12. Next week it's $20. Your paycheck, however, stays the same. You see, when a currency dies, it doesn't happen linearly. It happens exponentially. It's like a game of musical chairs played by giants. The moment the music stops, confidence breaks. Everyone rushes for a seat, real assets. The tragedy of this scenario is that the American people will be the last to know. The billionaire class knows this is coming. That's why Mark Zuckerberg is building a $100 million bunker in Hawaii. That's why Bill Gates is the largest owner of private farmland in the US. They are trading their paper fiat currency for hard assets that will survive the flood. But the average American? You have your savings in a bank account. You have a 401k filled with bonds. You are holding the bag. When the dollars come home, the standard of living in the United States collapses. We are used to consuming far more than we produce because the world subsidizes us. We run a trade deficit. We import cheap goods. If the dollar loses its value, those imports become unaffordable. That cheap t-shirt from Vietnam, it's now $50. That iPhone, it's $5,000. That gallon of gas, $15. We would be forced to live within our means for the first time in a century. And let me tell you, living within our means is going to feel like absolute poverty compared to what we are used to. This is the third worldification of America. You see it in Argentina. You see it in Turkey. It starts with inflation, then shortages, then social unrest. The scary part is that we don't produce enough stuff to soak up all those returning dollars. We deindustrialized. We sold our factories. So when the money comes back, there are no goods to buy, only bidding wars for what's left. This brings us to a terrifying realization. The US government might actually want this to happen, at least partially. Why? Because inflation is the only way to pay off that $35 trillion debt we talked about. If you owe $35 trillion and you destroy the value of the dollar by 50%, you effectively cut your debt in half in real terms. You pay back your bondholders with worthless paper. It's a soft default. It screws the savers to save the debtor. The victims of this crime will be the retirees, the pension funds, and the middle class. The people who followed the rules, saved their money, and trusted the system. So, if the paper money is destined to burn, where is the smart money going? What is the one asset that central banks are buying frantically while they tell you to buy stocks? In the next section, we're going to look at the barbarous relic, the shiny yellow metal that Wall Street mocks, but which is quietly being hoarded by the very people plotting the dollar's demise. It's time to talk about gold's revenge. 12. Gold's revenge and the buying spree. If you watch CNBC or listen to your financial advisor, they have probably told you the same thing for the last 20 years. Don't buy gold. Gold is a pet rock. It doesn't pay dividends. It sits there and does nothing. It's a barbarous relic from a primitive past. They tell you to buy tech stocks. They tell you to buy bonds. They tell you to trust the digital numbers on the screen. But here is the golden rule of finance. Watch what they do, not what they say. While Western economists were busy mocking gold bugs on Twitter, the people who actually run the global financial system, the central bankers, were engaging in the most aggressive buying spree in human history. Let's look at the numbers, because they don't lie. In 2022, global central banks bought 1,136 tons of gold. That was the highest level of net purchases on record going back to 1950. In 2023, they nearly matched it again, buying over 1,000 tons. Who is buying? It's not the United States. It's not Great Britain. The buyers are the revolt we have been talking about all video. The biggest buyer is the People's Bank of China. The second tier includes Poland, Singapore, India, and Turkey. Why? Why are these sophisticated modern nations frantically trading their valuable US dollars for useless lumps of metal? Because they know the storm is coming. Gold is the only financial asset on Earth that is not someone else's liability. If you hold a treasury bond, that is a promise that the US government will pay you. If you hold a dollar, that is a generic liability of the Federal Reserve. If you hold a stock, you rely on the company's performance. But if you hold a bar of gold, you don't need anyone to promise you anything. It just is. It is value, crystallized. For the Global South, the lesson of the Russia sanctions was traumatic. They realized that if their wealth was stored in dollars, it could be deleted with a keystroke. But you cannot delete a gold bar sitting in a vault in Shanghai. You cannot sanction a gold coin in a pocket in Mumbai. Gold is financial sovereignty. But there is a deeper, darker story here that the mainstream media almost never covers. It involves a boring bureaucratic rule change that happened in Switzerland, which effectively remonetized gold for the first time since 1971. It's called Basel III. I know it sounds like a bad movie sequel, but stick with me, because this is the plumbing that runs the world. The Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, sets the rules for how much capital banks need to hold to be considered safe. For decades, gold was classified as a Tier 3 asset. That meant it was considered risky. Banks couldn't count physical gold as a full equivalent to cash. It was discriminated against in favour of US Treasury bonds. But recently, under the new Basel III regulations, physical gold was reclassified as a Tier 1 asset. This is a massive deal. It means that for the biggest banks in the world, gold is now officially considered risk-free, just like cash. It means banks can hold gold to meet their solvency requirements. This quietly incentivized banks around the world to stop holding so much paper debt and start holding physical metal. It was a silent admission by the global elite that the debt experiment is failing, and they need to put a solid floor underneath the banking system before it collapses. And let's talk about China again, because they are playing a game of hide and seek with their gold reserves. Officially, China says they have about 2,200 tons of gold. That's a lot, but it's far less than the US, which claims 8,100 tons. But almost no serious analyst believes the Chinese number. Here is why. China is the world's largest producer of gold. They mine about 400 tons a year, and crucially, they do not export any of it. What happens in China stays in China. On top of that, they are the world's largest importer. Thousands of tons flow into Shanghai and Hong Kong every year. If you do the math, mining plus imports minus consumption, many experts estimate that China's real gold hoard is likely over 20,000 tons. That would be more than double the US reserves. Why would they lie? Why hide it? Because of the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. If China announces tomorrow that they have 20,000 tons of gold, the price of gold would skyrocket to $5,000 or $10,000 an ounce overnight. That would be great for them, but it would also devalue the billions of US dollars they still hold. They are accumulating quietly, keeping the price suppressed, filling their vaults before they pull the rug. They are preparing for the moment when the current fiat system resets. History shows us that every 80 to 100 years the monetary system collapses and resets. 1914, the classical gold standard ends. 1944, the Bretton Woods system begins. 1971, the gold window closes, the petrodollar begins. 202x, the petrodollar ends. And what begins? The BRICS nations are hinting at a new currency backed by a basket of commodities: oil, wheat, copper, and gold. If that happens, the US dollar, which is backed by nothing but $35 trillion in debt and political promises, will face a crisis of confidence unlike anything we have seen. And it's not just the East. Look at what Western allies are doing. In recent years, countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria have demanded to repatriate their gold. For decades, these countries kept their gold in the vaults of the New York Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. It was safer there during the Cold War, but recently they asked for it back. They wanted the physical metal flown back to Frankfurt and Vienna. Why? If you trust your ally, you leave your wallet at his house. If you demand your wallet back, it means the trust is gone. It means you want to make sure the gold is actually there. Fun fact: when Germany asked for their gold back from the US, it took years to deliver. And the bars they received had different serial numbers than the ones they deposited. This fueled massive conspiracy theories that the US didn't actually have the gold and had to scramble to buy or lease it to pay Germany back. Whether that's true or not, the optics were terrible. This is the run on the bank at a sovereign level. So, what does this mean for you? It means that while the media tells you gold is a relic, the smartest, most powerful entities on the planet are acting like it is the only lifeboat on the Titanic. They are swapping their paper tickets, dollars, for life vests, gold. They know that when the debt spiral we discussed in the last section finally spins out of control, the only thing that will retain value is the one thing governments cannot print. But as the dollar loses its status, it's not just our savings that are at risk, it is our safety. The American empire is built on a military machine that spans the globe, 800 bases in 70 countries, 11 aircraft carrier strike groups. It is a logistical behemoth that requires an infinite stream of money to operate. If the money printer breaks, the machine stops. In the next section, We are going to explore the terrifying geopolitical reality of a broke superpower. What happens to the US military when we can no longer afford to pay the soldiers, fuel the jets, or maintain the bases? The end of the petrodollar doesn't just mean expensive groceries, it means the end of the Pax Americana. 13. The end of infinite war funding. There is a saying that amateurs talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics, and the most important part of logistics is paying for it. The United States military is the most expensive organization in human history. We spend roughly $850 billion a year on defense. That is more than the next 10 countries combined. We maintain 750 to 800 military bases in over 70 nations. We have 11 aircraft carrier strike groups patrolling the 7 seas. For the last 80 years, this massive machine has guaranteed global trade. It keeps the pirates away from the shipping lanes. It keeps the oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. It is the muscle behind the rules-based international order. But here is the dirty secret of American military power. We haven't actually paid for it in decades. We didn't pay for the Iraq War with taxes. We didn't pay for the 20 years in Afghanistan with war bonds. We paid for them with debt. We swiped the national credit card, printed the money, and let inflation handle the rest. We could do this because of the petrodollar. Because the world needed dollars, the world bought our debt. Essentially, China and Saudi Arabia subsidized the very military that was designed to encircle them. It was a strategic absurdity that they tolerated because it was profitable. But as the petrodollar dies, that subsidy ends, and when the subsidy ends, the American empire faces a Suez moment. Let me give you a history lesson that every American needs to hear. The year was 1956. Great Britain was still a global superpower. They controlled the Suez Canal in Egypt, a vital artery for global trade. When Egypt tried to nationalize the canal, Britain, France and Israel invaded to take it back. Militarily, Britain could have easily won, but they had a problem. They were broke. They were in debt from World War II. President Eisenhower didn't want the war to happen, so he didn't send troops to stop the British. He sent bankers. He told the British government that if they didn't withdraw, the US would sell its massive holdings of British pounds. He threatened to crash their currency and destroy their economy. Britain had no choice. They withdrew. They were humiliated. And in that moment, the world knew the British Empire was dead. Not because they lost a battle, but because they lost the checkbook. The United States is now staring down the barrel of its own Suez moment. If we enter a major conflict, say, over Taiwan, and we need to print $5 trillion to fund it, but nobody buys our bonds, what happens? We would have to monetize that debt instantly. Hyperinflation would rip through the US economy within weeks. The cost of fuel for the jets, steel for the ships, and salaries for the soldiers would spiral out of control. We are already seeing the cracks. The US military is facing a massive recruitment crisis. They can't find enough people willing to serve. Why? Part of it is cultural, sure, but part of it is economic. A private salary doesn't buy what it used to. In a post-petrodollar world, the US will be forced to make a choice: the welfare state or the warfare state. We cannot afford both. When the interest on the debt hits $2 trillion or $3 trillion a year, the budget math breaks. We will have to close bases. We will have to bring the fleets home. We will have to stop being the world police. For some of you watching, that sounds great. Bring the troops home. Focus on America. But be careful what you wish for. When the US Navy stops patrolling the oceans, who takes over? The oceans don't stay empty. Piracy returns. Regional warlords take control of shipping lanes. Insurance rates for cargo ships skyrocket. The cost of everything you import, from coffee to computer chips, goes up. We are moving from a unipolar world, one cop, to a multipolar world, gang warfare. This brings us to the landscape of the future. If the dollar isn't the king, and the US military isn't the enforcer, what does the map look like? It doesn't look like Star Trek with one united planet. It looks more like Game of Thrones. In the next section, we're going to map out the multipolar currency world. It's a fractured, messy, and inefficient future where you live determines what money you spend and where globalization goes to die. 14. The multipolar currency world. For the last 30 years, we have lived in the era of hyperglobalization. It was a world without friction. You could sit in your underwear in Chicago, click a button on Amazon, and 3 days later, a package would arrive containing a gadget made in Shenzhen. using cobalt from Congo and microchips from Taiwan. You didn't care about the currency exchange rates. You didn't care about the trade treaties. You just paid in dollars and the magic happened. That world is dead. It is being replaced by something far more complicated, far more expensive, and far more dangerous. Welcome to the multipolar currency world. If the old world was like the World Wide Web, one open network where everyone could talk to everyone, the new world is the splinter net. It is a series of walled gardens, firewalls, and gated communities. In this future, there is no single king of money. The US dollar doesn't disappear. It doesn't vanish into thin air, but it shrinks. It becomes just one of several regional warlords fighting for territory. We are seeing the formation of three distinct economic blocks. The dollar bloc, the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and parts of Latin America. The Euro bloc, the European Union and its periphery, though they are increasingly caught in the middle. The BRICS bloc, China, Russia, India, the Middle East, and huge swathes of Africa. This is what economists call economic Balkanization. Let's simulate what it's actually like to do business in this fragmented world. Imagine you're an American manufacturer in 2030. You want to buy specialized machinery from China. In the old days, you sent a wire transfer in dollars. Easy. But now China imposes capital controls. They demand payment in digital yuan. Your American bank, under pressure from US regulators, refuses to process a transaction in the currency of a strategic adversary. You are stuck. You have to find a middleman. Maybe you route the money through a bank in Singapore or Dubai. You convert dollars to dirhams, then dirhams to yuan. Each step takes a fee. Each step takes time. Each step carries political risk. The machine that used to cost $50,000 now costs $85,000 and takes 6 months to arrive because of compliance checks. This is the death of efficiency. For decades, the dollar system made the world efficient. It greased the gears. By removing the grease, we're introducing sand into the engine of the global economy. This means the end of the deflationary era. The efficiency dividend, the phenomenon that made t-shirts and TVs cheaper every year, is over. When you break global supply chains into political blocks, costs go up. Period. We are moving from just-in-time manufacturing to just-in-case manufacturing. Companies can no longer source materials from the cheapest provider. They have to source from the friendliest provider. This is called friend-shoring. If you are Apple, you can't just build iPhones in China anymore. You have to move factories to India or Vietnam or bring them back to the US. That sounds patriotic, but it is massively inflationary. An American worker costs 10 times what a Chinese worker costs. So in a multipolar world, you, the consumer, pay the geopolitical tax. But the scariest part of this new world isn't the price of iPhones. It's the return of mercantilism. In a world where you can't trust the currency, trade starts to look a lot like barter. We are already seeing this. In 2023, Pakistan wanted to buy Russian oil, but they didn't have dollars, and Russia didn't want Pakistani rupees. So what did they do? They discussed trading oranges and wheat for fuel. Iran and Sri Lanka recently settled a trade deal using tea for oil. This is the future. I'll give you 3 tanker ships of LNG if you build me a railway. I'll give you rare earth minerals if you give me semiconductor technology. It is a raw, brute force economy where real assets matter more than financial derivatives. In the dollar world, the guy with the most credit was king. In the multipolar world, the guy with the most stuff is king. Russia has energy. China has manufacturing capacity. Brazil has food. Australia has minerals. What does the US have? We have the best software, the best universities, and the deepest financial markets. But you can't eat software, and you can't heat your home with a derivative contract. This shift puts the United States in a vulnerable position. We are a net importer of physical goods. We rely on the rest of the world to feed us and clothe us. If the Global South decides to hoard their resources within their own trading bloc, the shelves at Walmart start looking very empty. This is also a world of currency volatility. In the past, major currencies moved 1% or 2% a year against each other. In a fragmented world, you could see 20% swings in a month. If the BRICS announce a gold-backed note, the dollar could plummet 15% overnight. If the US sanctions China, the yuan could gyrate wildly. For a regular person trying to save for retirement, this is a nightmare. How do you plan for the future when the measuring stick, money, keeps changing length? You can't just save money anymore, because money is the thing that is under attack. This brings us to the final, most important question of this entire series. We have diagnosed the disease, we have traced the history from the secret meetings in 1974 to the gold vaults of 2024. We have shown you the cracks in the dam. So what do? You are not a central banker, you are not a prime minister, you cannot stop the petrodollar from dying, you cannot stop the debt from exploding. But you can build an ark. In the final section, we are going to pivot from the macro to the micro. We are going to give you the practical, actionable playbook on how to position your personal finances for the post-dollar era. We will talk about asset allocation, self-custody, and the mindset shift you need to survive the transition. The world is changing. Don't let your wealth die with the old system. 15. Preparing for the post-dollar era. We have covered a lot of ground today. We've travelled from the secret meeting rooms of Jeddah in 1974 to the digital battlefields of the future. We've looked at the $35 trillion debt bomb and the nations plotting to detonate it. If you've made it this far, you might be feeling a mix of emotions: fear, anger, helplessness. That is a normal reaction. When you realise the ground beneath your feet, the very money you use to buy food, is shifting, it's terrifying. But I want you to take a deep breath. Panic is expensive. Panic makes you sell at the bottom and buy at the top. Panic makes you vulnerable to scammers selling survival buckets and doomsday bunkers. We are not here to panic. We are here to prepare. The death of the petrodollar doesn't mean the world ends. It doesn't mean the sun won't rise tomorrow. It just means the rules of the game are changing. And if you know the new rules, you can win. Here is your survival guide for the post-dollar era. Step 1. Fire your mental accountant. The first thing you need to do is change your mindset. Stop measuring your wealth in dollars. If your house goes up in price from $400,000 to $600,000, did you get richer, or did the dollar just get weaker? If a loaf of bread costs twice as much, did the bread get twice as delicious? No. In a hyperinflationary or stagflationary environment, the nominal price of everything goes up. You might feel rich because your stock portfolio is up 10%, but if inflation is 12%, you are losing purchasing power. Stop chasing more dollars. Start chasing purchasing power. Ask yourself, can this asset buy me more eggs, more fuel, and more land in 10 years than it can today? Step 2. The death of the 60-40 portfolio. For 40 years, financial advisors have told you to put 60% of your money in stocks and 40% in bonds. In the post-dollar era, bonds are dead money. Think about it. A US Treasury bond is a contract where you lend money to the government for 10 or 30 years. In exchange, they pay you interest. But as we discussed, the government has to inflate the currency to pay its debt. If they are paying you 4% interest, but inflation is running at 6% or 8%, you are locking in a guaranteed loss. You're slowly bleeding to death. In a world of sovereign default and currency debasement, lending money to the government is not risk-free. It is return-free risk. You need to pivot from paper assets, bonds, cash, insurance annuities, to hard assets. Step 3. Get your insurance, gold and silver. I am not telling you to put 100% of your net worth into gold bars and bury them in the backyard. That's paranoia. But having 0% is financial negligence. Gold is your insurance policy against the central bank losing control. It is the only asset that has survived every currency collapse in the last 5,000 years. Aim for a prudent allocation, 5%, 10%, maybe 15% of your net worth. And here is the critical part. If you can't touch it, you don't own it. Do not buy paper gold, ETFs like GLD, if you're worried about a systemic collapse. In a crisis, those paper claims might be settled in cash, not metal. Buy physical coins, buy bars. Keep some at home in a safe and some in a private non-bank vault. Silver is the volatile little brother of gold. It has industrial utility, solar panels, electronics, and monetary history. In a currency crisis, silver often outperforms gold because it is more accessible to the average person for barter. Step 4. The digital lifeboat, Bitcoin. I know. Some of you hate crypto, you think it's a scam, and 99% of crypto is a scam, it's gambling. But Bitcoin is different. Bitcoin was created specifically for this scenario. It was born in 2008 out of the financial crisis as a response to money printing. It is the only asset in the world with a fixed supply, There will only ever be 21 million. No politician can print more, no central bank can dilute it. It is digital, portable, and unseizable, if you hold your own keys. In a world of capital controls, where governments try to stop you from moving your money across borders, Bitcoin is a teleporter for wealth. You can memorize 12 words, your seed phrase, cross a border with nothing in your pockets, and access your entire net worth on the other side. Even if you are skeptical, a small 1% to 5% allocation is a rational asymmetric bet against the dollar system. Step 5. Productive real assets. Gold and Bitcoin are great, but they don't produce anything. They just sit there. To build wealth, you need assets that yield. Real estate. But be careful. Residential real estate in the US is in a bubble. Look for cash-flowing rental properties, farmland or timberland. Farmland is historically one of the best hedges against inflation. People always need to eat. Stocks. Do not buy the entire market S&P 500 blindly. In an inflationary world, many zombie companies will go bankrupt. You want to own companies with pricing power. These are companies that can raise their prices when their costs go up, and customers still have to buy from them. Think energy companies, consumer staples, commodities producers, and defense contractors. Step 6. Debt as a weapon. Debt destroys you in deflation, but it can make you rich in inflation, if you use it right. If you have fixed-rate debt, like a 30-year mortgage at 3%, do not pay it off early. That is good debt. Why? Because you are paying the bank back with cheaper debased dollars. If inflation hits 10% and your loan is 3%, the bank is effectively paying you to live in your house. The real value of your debt is shrinking every year. However, variable rate debt, credit cards, adjustable rate mortgages, is suicide. Pay that off immediately. The moment interest rates spike to defend the dollar, those payments will crush you. Step 7. The ultimate asset you. Finally, the most important hedge against a collapsing currency is your ability to produce value. If the dollar collapses, the guy with $1 million in the bank is poor. The guy who knows how to fix a generator, grow food, suture a wound, or code in Python is rich. Invest in skills. Invest in your health. Invest in a network of trusted friends and family. In a multipolar, fragmented world, community is the ultimate safety net. Final thoughts. The petrodollar system wasn't evil. It was just a mechanism. It gave the United States 50 years of unparalleled prosperity. It allowed us to win the Cold War. It allowed us to build a middle class. But nothing lasts forever. The mechanism is broken. The world is moving on. You can mourn the old world, or you can position yourself for the new one. The transition will be volatile. It will be messy. There will be winners and losers. The losers will be the ones holding the bag of paper promises. The winners will be the ones holding hard assets, real skills and independent minds. The slow death of the petrodollar isn't the end of the story. It's just the turning of the page. Make sure you are the one writing your next chapter. If you found value in this deep dive, do me a favor. The algorithm hates long, complex topics like this. It prefers cat videos and 10-second dances. So, if you want to see more content about the real mechanics of the global economy, hit that like button. It actually makes a difference. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Are you preparing for the post-dollar world? Do you think the yuan will take over, or are we heading for a gold standard? Let's argue about it down below. If you want to understand how the central banks are manipulating the market right now, check out our upcoming video on the Great Reset. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay skeptical, and keep stacking.